On April 3rd, 2025, a single document from Washington sent shockwaves through the humid industrial parks of Bac Ninh and Haiphong. The announcement was a reciprocal tariff package, a trade war escalation that hit Vietnam with a staggering 46% duty on all exports to the United States. For a nation that relies on the US consumer for over 25% of its GDP, this wasn't just a policy shift, it was a death sentence. The Vietnamese stock market plunged. Emergency cabinet meetings were called in Hanoi. The world watched, expecting the Vietnam miracle to evaporate overnight as manufacturing fled back to North America. But then something unprecedented happened. Instead of collapsing, Vietnam negotiated. By July 2025, they didn't just survive, they pivoted. While the rest of the world was bracing for 60% tariffs on China, Vietnam walked away with a 20% strategic advantage. Welcome to 2026. This is the story of how Vietnam turned a global trade war into a national gold rush, aiming for a record-breaking 10% GDP growth, while the West remains stagnant. This is the art of the tariff arbitrage. To understand 2026, we have to acknowledge that the flat world of the 2000s is dead. We have entered the era of the great fragmentation. Global trade is no longer about the lowest cost, it's about the lowest political cost. The 2025 46% shock was designed to force high-tech manufacturing back to the US. The logic was simple: make it too expensive to build abroad. But the policymakers missed a crucial detail. Western infrastructure wasn't ready. You can't rebuild a 40-year-old electronics ecosystem in 6 months. Multinationals like Apple and Samsung didn't look at the 46% tariff and think, let's go to Ohio. They looked at the map and thought, who can help us bypass this? Vietnam, with its $123 billion trade surplus and its golden population, was the only country with the scale to act as a pressure valve. In late 2025, while the headlines screamed deglobalization, Vietnam was actually seeing a 17% surge in exports. They were the accidental target that became the intentional winner. In July 2025, Hanoi pulled off a masterclass in economic diplomacy. They signed the framework for reciprocal, fair, and balanced trade. In trade circles, we call this the toll booth agreement. Here's the mechanism. Vietnam realized they couldn't bypass the American market for free anymore. So they negotiated a lower toll. Hanoi agreed to drop tariffs on US SUVs, LNG, and pork to zero. They traded market access for American farmers to keep the highway open for Vietnamese microchips. The result? A 20% capped tariff rate. Now let's do the math. If you're a CEO in 2026, you have two choices for your next $5 billion factory. You can stay in China and pay 60% tariffs, or move to Vietnam and pay 20%. That 40% gap is the tariff arbitrage. It's the reason why, on October 26th, Vietnam Airlines casually dropped $8 billion on 50 Boeing aircraft. It wasn't just a purchase, it was a down payment to keep Washington happy. Vietnam isn't just a country anymore, it's a tariff shelter. In 2026, the China Plus One strategy has become a three-way fight between Vietnam, China, and Mexico. But look at the numbers. Labor cost is the foundation. In 2026, a factory worker in Vietnam costs you $3 an hour. In Mexico, it's $4.50. In China's coastal hubs, it's now over $6.50. But it's not just about the wage. Mexico has the USMCA backdoor, but Washington is closing it. In early 2026, the US cracked down on Chinese-funded phantom factories in Mexico, forcing a 50% tariff on Chinese origin goods there. Meanwhile, Vietnam's side door remains wide open. While Mexico struggles with labor disputes and aging infrastructure, Vietnam is leveraging a golden population. 67.8% of its people are of working age. This is a structural moat that Mexico can't match. For mid-tech electronics, Vietnam has effectively established a monopoly on the China exodus. But here's the math they're hiding. If you pick up a smartphone in 2026 and it says "Made in Vietnam," you're looking at a mirage. The localization rate for high-tech goods in Vietnam is only 15 to 20%. That means for every $1,000 laptop exported from Haiphong, $800 of its value still comes from Chinese components, the logic boards, the sensors, the displays. This is the localization trap. Vietnam is currently a giant assembly line. A smartphone's journey starts in Shenzhen, travels to northern Vietnam for 3 days of assembly, and then hits the US market. As long as substantial transformation happens in a Vietnamese factory, it qualifies for that sweet 20% tariff instead of the 60% China rate. The risk? Washington knows this. In 2026, U.S. Customs is already threatening a 40% transshipment penalty if the Vietnamese value add doesn't increase. Vietnam is a bridge between two warring giants, and bridges are dangerous places to live. Follow the money, and you'll see that the $27.6 billion FDI surge in 2025 wasn't a fluke. It was a highly concentrated bet by the world's tech Goliaths. Look at Samsung. By June 2025, they hit a milestone of 2 billion phones produced in Vietnam. They now account for nearly 20% of the entire country's exports. Samsung didn't just build factories. They built an empire in Bac Ninh, where 257 Vietnamese companies now serve as direct suppliers. Then there's Foxconn. In early 2026, they officially moved iPad and MacBook lines to Vietnam and are now building a $621 million gigafactory in the north. They aren't just here for the cheap labor. They're here because Vietnam's banking sector grew credit by 19% last year, funneling billions into industrial zones. Vietnam has replaced its rice paddies with the world's most concentrated electronics hub. But there are two walls that could stop this surge dead: the infrastructure wall and the green wall. First, the power grid. Vietnam is currently facing a $135 billion energy deficit. In 2025, rolling brownouts in the north already halted production lines for Samsung and Foxconn. The government's Power Development Plan 8 is a desperate race to build LNG plants and wind farms, but the grid is screaming under the weight of the new factories. Second, the green wall. In 2026, the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism officially takes effect. Because Vietnam's grid is still heavy on coal, its cheap exports are about to get hit with a 25% carbon tax. If Vietnam doesn't go green by 2027, its cost advantage evaporates. The next global factory might be built on a foundation of coal that the rest of the world is about to tax into oblivion. So, what is the verdict? In 2026, Vietnam has successfully positioned itself as the indispensable middleman. It is the reason your next laptop doesn't cost $3,000. It is the pressure valve that keeps global inflation from exploding in a world of trade wars. But Vietnam is still a bridge, not a fortress. Its 10% GDP growth target is a high-wire act. If they can move from assembly to innovation, and if they can survive the energy crisis, they will dominate the next decade. If not, they are simply a temporary shelter for a global economy that has forgotten how to play nice. The world is fragmented, the math is brutal, and for now, all roads to the American consumer lead through Hanoi. Thanks for watching.